In August 1971, Lewis Powell sent a confidential memo to the US Chamber of Commerce. Powell, about to be elevated to the Supreme Court by Richard Nixon, argued that criticism of and opposition to the US free enterprise system had gone too far, and that the time had come, indeed it is long overdue, for the wisdom, ingenuity, and resources of American business to be marshalled against those who would destroy it. Powell argued that individual action was insufficient. Strength, he wrote, lies in organisation, in careful long-range planning and implementation, in consistency of action over an indefinite period of years, in the scale of financing available only through joint effort, and in the political power available only through united action and national organisers. The National Chamber of Commerce, he argued, should lead an assault upon the major institutions, universities, schools, the media, publishing, the courts, in order to change how individuals think about the corporation, the law, the culture, and the individual. The exact impact of Powell's call for an organised front of the elite is unclear, but the American Chamber of Commerce subsequently expanded its base from around 60,000 firms in 1972 to over 250,000 10 years later. Jointly with the National Association of Manufacturers, it amassed an immense campaign chest to lobby Congress and engage in research. The Business Roundtable, an organisation of CEOs committed to the aggressive pursuit of political power for the corporation, was founded in 1972 and thereafter became the centrepiece of collective pro-business action. The corporations involved accounted for about 1/2 of the GNP of the United States during the 1970s, and they spent close to $1 billion annually on political matters. Think tanks such as the Heritage Foundation, the Hoover Institute, the Center for the Study of American Business, and the American Enterprise Institute were formed with corporate banking both to polemicize and, when necessary as in the case of the National Bureau of Economic Research, to construct serious technical and empirical studies and political philosophical arguments broadly in support of neoliberal policies. With abundant finance furnished by wealthy individuals, a flood of tracts and books, with Nozick's Anarchy, State and Utopia perhaps the most widely read and appreciated, emerged espousing neoliberal values. A TV version of Milton Friedman's Free to Choose was funded with a grant from the Scaife Foundation, established by billionaire oligarch Richard Mellon Scaife in 1977.
When you see around the globe the maldistribution of wealth, the desperate plight of millions of people in underdeveloped countries, when you see so few haves and so many have-nots, when you see the greed and the concentration of power within, did you ever have a moment of doubt about capitalism and whether greed's a good idea to run on?
Well, first of all, tell me, is there some society you know that doesn't run on greed? You think Russia doesn't run on greed? You think China doesn't run on greed? What is greed? Of course, none of us are greedy. It's only the other fellow who's greedy. The world runs on individuals pursuing their separate interests. The great achievements of civilization have not come from government bureaus. Einstein didn't construct his theory under order from a bureaucrat. Henry Ford didn't revolutionize the automobile industry that way.
Business was learning to behave and spend as a class. Powell did not argue for extending state power, but business should assiduously cultivate the state and when necessary use it aggressively and with determination. But exactly how is state power to be deployed to reshape common sense understandings? The New York fiscal crisis of the 1970s would become an iconic case in the use of force and austerity to implement an economic system of neoliberalism. Capitalist restructuring and deindustrialization had for years been eroding the economic base of the city. Rapid suburbanization had left much of the central city impoverished. The result was explosive social unrest on the part of marginalised populations during the 1960s, defining what came to be known as the urban crisis. The expansion of public employment and public provision, facilitated in part by generous federal funding, was seen as the solution. Faced with fiscal difficulties, President Nixon declared the urban crisis over in the early 1970s. This meant significantly diminished federal aid. As the recession gathered pace, the gap between revenues and outlays in the New York City budget increased. At first, financial institutions were prepared to bridge the gap, but in 1975 a powerful cabal of investment bankers, led by Walter Wriston of Citibank, refused to roll over the debt and pushed the city into technical bankruptcy. The restoration of class power was almost certainly what investment bankers like Walter Wriston had in mind. Wriston equated all forms of government intervention in the US and Britain with communism. The city appealed to then President Ford for a bailout. The President's Secretary of the Treasury, William Simon, strongly advised President Ford to refuse aid to the city. The terms of any bailout, he said, should be so punitive, the overall experience so painful, that no city, no political subdivision would ever be tempted to go down the same road. Like Wriston, Simon understood that New York would be a crucial battleground in the rolling out of neoliberalism. The bailout that followed entailed the construction of new institutions that took over the management of the city budget. They had first claim on city tax revenues in order to first pay off bondholders. Whatever was left went for essential services. The effect was to curb the aspirations of the city's powerful municipal unions, to implement wage freezes and cutbacks in public employment and social provisions such as education, public health and transport, and to import user fees. Tuition was introduced into the New York university system for the first time. The final indignity was the requirement that municipal unions should invest their pension funds in city bonds. Unions then either moderated their demands or faced the prospect of losing their pension funds through city bankruptcy. This amounted to a coup by the financial institutions against the democratically elected government of New York City, and it was every bit as effective as the military coup that had occurred earlier in Chile with Pinochet.
Felix Rohatyn, financial wizard extraordinary, is the most important man in New York City today. He's chairman of the Municipal Assistance Corporation, or Big Mac as it's more commonly known, after America's favorite hamburger. Big Mac is a committee of the city's leading financiers and bankers, set up by the state of New York to raise the billions of dollars needed by the city of New York.
Wealth was redistributed to the upper classes in the midst of a fiscal crisis. The New York crisis was a decisive battle in a new war, one in which a financial elite would use their money power to redistribute both money and power away from the majority into the hands of a smaller and smaller minority of finance capitalists. The purpose was to show others what is happening in New York could, and if necessary would, happen to them.
So a new committee was set up to manage the city's finances. Out of 9 members, 8 of them were bankers. It was the start of an extraordinary experiment, where the financial institutions took power away from the politicians and started to run society themselves. The city had no other option. The bankers enforced what was called austerity on the city, insisting that thousands of teachers, policemen and firemen were sacked. This was a new kind of politics. The old politicians believed that crises were solved through negotiations and deals. The bankers had a completely different view. They were just the representatives of something that couldn't be negotiated with, the logic of the market. To them, there was no alternative to this system. It should run society.
Just by shifting paper around, these slobs can make $60–65 million in a single transaction. That would take care of all of the layoffs in the city. So it's reckless, it's cruel, and it's a disgrace.
There'd be a fair number of bankers, of course, who'd say, well, it's the unions who have been too greedy. Now, what would your reaction be to that?
I guess they're right in a way. If you can make $60 million on a single transaction and a worker makes $8–9,000 a year, I suppose they're correct, and as they go back to their little estates in Greenwich, Connecticut, I want to wish them well, the slobs.
While resistance to the austerity measures was widespread, it did little to slow the counter-revolution from above. Much of the social infrastructure of the city was diminished, and the physical infrastructure such as the subway system deteriorated markedly for lack of investment or even maintenance. Daily life in New York became grueling and the civic atmosphere turned mean. The city government, the municipal labour movement and working class New Yorkers were effectively stripped of much of the power they had accumulated over the previous 3 decades. Demoralised working class New Yorkers reluctantly assented to the new realities. But the New York investment bankers did not walk away from the city. They seized the opportunity to restructure it in ways that suited their agenda. The creation of a good business climate was a priority. This meant using public resources to build appropriate infrastructure for business, coupled with subsidies and tax incentives for capitalist enterprises. Corporate welfare substituted for people's welfare. The city's elite institutions were mobilised to sell the image of the city as a cultural centre and tourist destination, inventing the famous logo, "I love New York." The ruling elites moved, often fractiously, to support the opening up of the cultural field to all manner of diverse cosmopolitan currents. The narcissistic exploration of self, sexuality and identity became the leitmotif of bourgeois urban culture. Artistic freedom and artistic license, promoted by the city's powerful cultural institutions, led, in effect, to the neoliberalisation of culture. The city's elites acceded, though not without a struggle, to the demand for lifestyle diversification, including those attached to sexual preference and gender, and increasing consumer niche choices. New York became the epicenter of postmodern cultural and intellectual experimentation. Meanwhile, the investment bankers reconstructed the city economy around financial activities, ancillary services such as legal services, the media, and consumerism. City government was more and more construed as an entrepreneurial rather than a social democratic or even managerial entity. The management of the New York fiscal crisis pioneered the way for neoliberal practices both domestically under Reagan and internationally through the IMF in the 1980s. It established the principle that, in the event of a conflict between the integrity of the financial institutions and bondholders' returns on the one hand, and the well-being of the citizens on the other, the former was to be privileged. It emphasised that the role of governments was to create a good business climate rather than look at the needs and well-being of the population at large. The politics of the Reagan administration of the 1980s became the New York scenario of the 1970s writ large.